Got that. And we'll do my little, we'll go for my little kind of intro as we get going. And hopefully, so a quick welcome to everyone who's those on Zoom who I've already said hello to, but those who are watching or on the stream on Facebook or YouTube and so on, you're very welcome. So we're here for the Light Lunch Bible study. Let's kind of, we're just, I'll quickly pray. We're looking at Matthew 10, 5 to 15. I think in the email I said 5 to 10, but as I looked at it, I thought actually it makes much more sense to get to verse 15 today. So Father, just as we think about mission, we all have our role to play in the commission that you first give your disciples. And Father, I do thank you. It is a commission. It's something you participate with us in. And Father, just inspire us today as we take time to think about the way in which you call us to be salt and light into the world. In Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Now, I've suddenly realised that I can't see it. There it is. Okay. So, oh, hang on. I need to go back a few. Let's go back to the... There we go. Here we go. So we're going to be... we're looking... we're into Matthew 10. As we saw last week. At the beginning, we hear about how Jesus has appointed out of the wider group of disciples that have been gathering around him. He's nominated 12 whom he's going to specifically commission and send out. And so we looked at those lists last week. And as we start through the chapter 10 as a whole, we think of as the kind of missions sermon. And we're going to look at verses 5 to 15. So if you think about the structure, I didn't actually put this on the PowerPoint slides, but if I just talk to it, we have the first couple of verses, first 4 verses where Jesus introduces the 12. We run through them. As we looked at them, we actually saw you can see some shape and some structure within that list of 12. Then chapters 5 to 15 are really at the heart of the historic moment. And what I mean by that is... the way Matthew is written, he's collected Jesus' teaching together and he's kind of anchored them to an event that does happen in the historic flow of Jesus' ministry. So Jesus really goes up the mountain just outside of Capernaum. His disciples really do come to him and he starts to teach them on his ethical agenda from there. But then what Matthew has done is he's structured and organised a much broader sense of the teaching that belongs to that period so that it stands there as a standalone sermon. And there's a good reason for Matthew doing that because his gospel in the early days here is being used to disciple loads of new converts. And so by bringing it all together into a single sermon, you've got this is what Jesus has to say about how we relate to morality and the law. And we call that the Sermon on the Mount, anchored to a real moment in history. But there's stuff that kind of belongs to a broader perspective in the mix. And it's the same way with the sermon here on mission. In these verses, we're going to see probably what is part of the historical moment where Jesus commissions them for a very specific mission, which is going to be around the Jewish area that Jesus has been ministering in, but now they're going to go and do it. As you move on through the sermon, as we're going to see next week and the week afterwards, and we then move on to a broader missions agenda, which is more relevant to the period when Matthew is actually being written, where the gospel is now going into Samaria, Syria. It's going up into what we think of as modern day Turkey at that period. Some of it is covered in the book of Acts, but some of it is also part of the early church history. And so he talks about things that are not so relevant to the Jewish context there. And then the final third of which we'll look at in a couple of weeks' time, is much more when you're in the process of mission, it's about how to stay encouraged in that context. When you're being persecuted, you seem to be getting into trouble all over the place and so on. So there's a sort of 3 sections. First section, which is very focused on what is it Jesus wants his disciples to do during this next period. Then as we kind of blend from there into what's relevant for a broader, wider missions context. And then finally, actually, how do I stay encouraged? How do I understand what's going on when I'm being when I preach and the riot starts and then I get arrested and beaten up? How do I stay encouraged in that context? So there are these kind of three sections. So I thought it's probably sensible to kind of look at the first section together, which is all as one go. So we'll look at verses 5 through to 15. So Jesus sent these 12 out. So the 12 we've just thought about, having instructed them, saying, avoid the Gentile roads and don't enter any Samaritan cities. So you can see straight away that the context is in the kind of the Galilee area where they've been travelling anyway. And in that context, don't push down into the south where the Samaritan cities are, or where they spill into, and we've got a mix of Samaritan or Jewish villages. Stay away from the Samaritans, and also the Gentile roads, or the way of the Gentiles, some translations put it. And I think the reason why the Gospels put it that way is it's if you imagine the way in which a culture comes in and dominates, they tend to the alien environment tends to kind of build itself up in centres and thoroughfares. So what you find in Galilee is there are certain cities that are much more Roman. The city of Tiberias, for instance, on the Sea of Galilee, which is built up really for the Roman population, and they have their roads in and their roads out. And so when Jesus uses this phrase, avoid the way of the Gentiles, what he's saying is, as I'm sending you guys out, I'm going to send you out, first of all, into a relatively comfortable, if I can put it that way, a comfortable context to practice how to do this mission that I'm drawing you into, which which has this transformative effect on the world. And the gospel really does have a transformative effect. I've because those of course that know my history, I've got being healed from cancer and so on. We look at the miraculous as it breaks into the individual's life, and often we focus on those things, but we miss, if you like, the very powerful way in which a culture is lifted up as the gospel gets into it. And in that context, Jesus allows it to be quite straightforward for this first wave for his disciples by saying, don't go to Samaritans where you're going to get into big bust ups there, because we've got historic divisions and you're going to get drawn into stuff that's going to distract, it's going to take away, you're not going to learn the lessons. Don't bother going to the Gentiles, because the message to the Gentiles is going to again cause great big controversies. But go instead to where there's this strongly Judaic tradition. You're therefore speaking into a context where there's an awful lot in common. At the moment, Jesus's mission is not dissimilar to he's doing it slightly differently, and his message is nuanced in a way amongst other Pharisaic leaders, but they will be understood in that kind of a context. So as they go in, they won't be massively controversial, because travelling preachers do travel. The rabbinic networks, Jesus sits quite comfortably at one level in that. We often think of the Pharisees being anti-Jesus. If you read the Gospels carefully, Jesus positions a lot of his teaching, as if you study it in context of other rabbis and other Pharisaic rabbis, and he kind of affirms them when he can affirm them, he challenges them when he thinks they're not adequate. But right the way through, you have Pharisees who travel with Jesus. Jesus eats with them. He eats in the house of Simon the Pharisee in his last week, as we were thinking last night. So that there is a context for you that doesn't have to be instantly and unhelpfully contradictory or conflicting. And so as we start this sermon, as Jesus is kind of presenting the agenda for exactly what the disciples are going to do, he kind of gives them this focus. So you're going rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, the reason, as I said earlier, we know that there is a second section is because as we move on through the sermon, Jesus starts talking about standing before governors and kings. Well, that's not likely to happen at this moment in history. There's a governor down in the south, Pilate, but they're not going there. There is a king up in the north. That's Herod Agrippa. Herod Antipas at this stage. But there's not a huge amount of conflict with him. That's going to come in a bit. But they're not going to stand. None of them are actually going to stand before Herod Antipas and their context and so on. So we understand that later part of the mission sermon is instruction that Jesus has given to his disciples in the context of mission beyond the immediate call of the next few months or the next few weeks where the 12 are going out. So focus on the lost sheep of the house of Israel. We're going to lay a foundation here. You're going to learn some lessons. You're going to play the role that I have played with you, which is in spreading this message, which balances traditional understandings of there needs to be a way of doing stuff. There needs to be the law, but we need to approach it with a layer of grace and compassion and understanding. And that's what I've been working through with you, and you're going to spread this out. And so he says then, so proclaiming as you go, saying the kingdom of heaven is at hand, i.e. you can get hold of it. You've all been talking about the kingdom's coming and it's far off and it's going to suddenly arrive, but actually as it arrives, to recognize it's something you've got to get hold of, you need to reach out and grab it. And then you demonstrate that. And so he gives them a context. I want you to heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, and drive out demons. And freely you've received and freely give. And so that suddenly makes sense of the things as we've read in Matthew when it has gone through those 10 miraculous encounters after the Sermon on the Mount. And we regularly hear Jesus challenging his disciples, ye of little faith, if you'd stretched your faith, you could have done it this way. So now in one sense, those messages where Jesus has challenged them to step out in faith and you could follow the example. And by commissioning the 12, he's giving them an opportunity in an environment where they don't need to get into arguments of conflict of culture, if you like, into culture conflict. Within those normal the normal flow of the culture, they can now start to stretch their faith. They can have a go at praying for the sick, raising the dead, cleansing the lepers, and so on. Jesus uses that nice little phrase, freely if you receive, freely give. You've experienced it with me. Now you try and live that way. And I do think that there's something in that phrase, which is a great challenge to how I try and pursue the supernatural when I'm trying to live out my Christian life. Because I find in an internal kind of way, I'll say I vacillate from that thing of, do I feel worthy enough to do this? And actually that thing of, it's not really about whether I'm worthy enough. It's actually, there's need here. And can I try to act in faith to meet a need? Because my experience is sometimes when I've tried to live more that way, rather than obsessing as to whether I'm kind of somehow qualified or worthy enough to do it, that's when you do see the things and you do see the answers to the prayer, and you do come away thinking, how did that happen? Because, I'm just the same person as I was 3 weeks ago when I had something similar, when I was totally focused on, am I good enough? But actually to kind of see it in that flow of, I needed something, someone reached out to me. I needed healing and someone reached out and I received healing. And I now see a need, and actually just as I received freely, and I didn't worry too much about the theology or the kind of the immediate morality or any of the worthiness of the person who prayed for me. I'm just grateful they took the risk, and they did. And that's fantastic. Maybe I need to now stand in that flow. So there's something of that. I think I kind of hear it in that freely you receive, freely give. You weren't worthy enough to receive, but you received anyway. And now actually you're going to do it in the same way. You may not feel qualified, but you see the need. So try, have a go. And I like to hear it that way, because you hear those things: heal the sick, raise the dead. Oh, that freaks me out a bit. I can't promise that if I pray for you when you're dead that you'll come back, but actually as I see need, we step out in it. And that is, I can say that's genuinely part of my own sort of testimony. I've seen some remarkable things. I don't in any sense feel like I'm a fantastically well developed healing ministry. It's just sometimes you try them and you think, oh, I better have a go. I will share this the story I put in one of my books. It's 100% true. the only time I've seen someone, I won't go the long story, but seen someone who's healed of Parkinson's, I had zero faith for it whatsoever. So much so that I looked around for somebody else who I knew who'd been healed recently, and asked them to come and pray with this person for me. And as I prayed, I knew I was being a total hypocrite if I prayed for healing, because I had no faith for it whatsoever. So I actually started praying, thanking God for all the good things about the person. You know how it kind of goes. To cut a long story short, 2 days later we got the phone call, and the guy had for the last 2 days had not been shaking, and he'd found himself running when he was walking with his dog, and he hadn't been able to do. And I remember talking to the guy I called over, and he said, when you called me over and I realised who you wanted me to pray for, he said, I just had no faith whatsoever. I could tell you more about the story because it was really challenging for me. There was nothing in me that thought, I've got this and I can really own this, you know. It was quite literally, I am obliged to pray for you because you've asked me to, because I've just been standing at the front preaching, so I better go ahead and do it now. Does that, if that makes sense? And it's in that, sometimes in that context of delivering to the need, that's my experience anyway. Is that it's in that context that you see, okay, that's a remarkable thing. I'll never forget that now. That's become part of my story of my relationship with the Lord. So again, it's in this context of Jesus setting them out at this point where he tells them, don't carry gold or silver or copper in your belts. It's important to recognize the context, because otherwise what we do is we abstract it. So we don't mean that everybody who goes out in the mission field goes with no means of payment. I had a friend I worked with in software once upon a time who'd in his youth, when he got saved, he used to travel into countries with no money, and he tried on a couple of occasions when he crossed various borders, when they said, when they asked the questions, as they do, what means have you got to pay? And so he told them that he was kind of living this way. He actually got in the days before total open borders in Europe, he actually got arrested by the Danish immigration services and put in prison overnight and sent back on the next ferry, because he had told them up front he didn't carry the money, God would provide him when he got there, and they figured he was going to be busking or doing something illegal. But it doesn't mean you have to do it that way. But in this context, Jesus is wanting them to stretch their faith, to understand how God will step in when they need him to. So it doesn't become, if you like, a presumption that I can do mission without any money. But it becomes, actually, I learned the confidence of, actually, when I thought that's what I needed and that would be my security, in the context of this first mission that Jesus sends the disciples out on, he tells them to go without the gold and the silver and the copper. That's not because Jesus doesn't sometimes have copper, and because after all we hear that it was Judas Iscariot who looked after their kind of common purse, but most of the time they're living by the favour that comes back to them as they minister, and that's how Jesus has lived, and he wants them to experience the same. So take no bag for the road, or an extra tunic, or sandals, or staff, for the worker is worthy of his support. That it's not just an extra tunic. The whole list of things is all predicated to that word, the two. Don't take two tunic, sandals, staff. They're all part of the same idea. In other words, you go with what you need, but you're not looking to kind of you're not looking to have provided your security by overcompensating. Because the worker is worthy of his support. So actually what you're doing, there's something in the spiritual realm that will recompense it. And again, I don't want to sound like I've got this sussed, because I really don't. But I can honestly and truthfully say we've lived with those things. There's often times where I think this doesn't really make sense. And we have a number of vaguely Christian friends and contacts. If that's not a rude way of referring to it, people who aren't necessarily right in there in church, who can't understand somehow the way we're able to live. That's not because we don't have any means of support, but somehow the what comes back sometimes is not because it's been demanded. It's just the way you try to live beyond that sense of the basic, and actually. and I want you to hear this kind of in absolute truth. Sometimes it's darn stressful, but we've had the most remarkable layers of delivery at times when you just don't again, a bit similar to what I was saying before. You think, why did we deserve it this time but not last time? I don't know, but somehow we sit here today and we have a bigger house than we would have expected at this stage if you look at what our income levels were. We have two cars, you know, and yet again, even the stories of often how cars have come in, they're not straightforward. You know, there are weird things that happen as you go, and but it's neither is it a slot machine, if I can put it that way. But something about the way you try and live life into the kingdom, there is a wonderful sense of which, okay, if you know you're trying to do the right thing before the Lord, just do it, and let Him kind of supply those extra benefits beyond as you go. So in whatever city or village you enter into, ascertain who is suitably worthy. I put it that way. You know, it says inquire as to who is worthy is often the thing, but the word worthy is. It could be used kind of in terms of they're respectable, they're worthy, they're trustworthy, honourable. It's kind of, it wraps a whole. So I've given it that little compound. That you're looking for someone when you go in who somehow they are supposed to partner with you in this. That's perhaps what makes them suitably worthy. So when you enter, look for the person that somehow the Spirit is already preparing. That doesn't mean to say they're necessarily the enthusiastic believer who comes out to meet you, but there's something about the Spirit of God on this connection, and stick with that. Remain there. See, again, it's very easy to think we don't want to be any burden on anybody. So, you know, I'll stay with a night for you and a night here and a night there and so on. And Jesus is saying in this context, let's assume when you go in that actually what the Spirit of God wants you to do is partner with Him in stuff that He's already working in. So try and find the people that He's already working with. Don't waste your time on those He's not. And so on entering the household, embrace it. You often see it says welcome, but actually it's the idea of the word is encompassing or enfolding. So it's greeting in one sense, greet it, but in an enthusiastic way. So you enter a household, you're open to it, you're wanting to embrace it, and if there's something that this is the place that is suitably worthy. Should have said suitably worthy there as well, shouldn't I? I missed that one. If that is the place, then let your peace kind of rest on it, and you'll feel it. But if it isn't, then you'll feel something in you that kind of gets the return. You'll know this isn't necessarily the place, so you can move on in a small way. And then we get these verses which I think we miss the context of whom they're spoken to. So, because whoever doesn't receive nor hear your words, shake the dust off your feet as you leave the house or that city. And, we have this kind of image of, taking the sandals off and dusting them off. And it's kind of like, let your own rebellion be on your own head. But if you can't find someone like that, really what Jesus is saying is don't worry, don't carry the disappointment with you. Don't carry the failure with you. There is plenty of work out there. So you don't carry it with you. It's not about condemnation on them. It's kind of symbolically we're going to take our shoes off and dust it off and you're all damned and off we go again, feeling smug about ourselves. It is much more a kind of an encouragement to those involved in the process, because you do feel a level of compassion into an area. And time again, you realise that there's something that sometimes there are just times when it feels like you can't do anything about it. But in the end, it's not our mission. It's not our mission. So I hear the words of Jesus much more in that sense of don't you own it. Don't own the disappointment. Don't own the failure, if I can put it that way. So you can fail and not have to carry that with you. Truly I say to you, on Judgment Day, it would be more tolerable for the region of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that city. So, okay, there is a little bit of they didn't accept it. But I think much more it's that it's encouraging for for the person who's involved in it. Oh yeah, we got to the very end of it. Oh, is that? Oh, that's my. Okay, that's the verse. It's at this point we start to transition into the wider sense of ministry. So just final kind of comments then as we kind of draw all the things together. As we go through these verses, what we're having in one sense is we've got the beginning of how Jesus wants his disciples to experience what it is like, not just to try and live by the things Jesus has taught, but by how to share them, how to transfer them over, how to draw others into the conversation. As we kind of put the things together, I realised as I was preparing, just reading through this morning, literally before we kind of went live, I've often thought about them going out in pairs. But actually, we've just gone through, as we saw last week, there's a kind of a natural sense of four. So there may be small little teams of disciples going to these places, and they find somebody in each town, and it feels like the Spirit is already working with these people. So they lodge with them. So in actual fact, what's happening is we focus on the heal the sick, raise the dead, and so on. But we miss the fact that happens alongside a community. As I have got older, if I can put it that way, I can't put it that way, but I know that some will feel, even my 55 years are a meager 55 years compared with some. As I've got older, the more I've understood the absolute importance of having a familial community for real transformation. The supernatural often earns you a hearing, and it earns a certain level of openness, but it doesn't produce the transformation in the individual. And that almost entirely, and it is something that has been studied now, happens within the context of the community. So, if someone receives a healing, I can remember in my days as a youth worker, you often go back to your early experiences, not because you haven't had other later ones, but they're often ones that stand out in your mind. Think of loads of young people we met on the streets and we prayed for who got various elements of healing. The one that always makes me smile is a little bit rude to kind of tell the story, but he wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. He'd been into bodybuilding, this lad, amongst several young people, and he'd been taking these hormones for bulking up, and they had produced what has a euphemistic term which I won't use, but actually had produced an effect within his chest that meant he started to get kind of swelling like a female breast, and I remember him wanting to get us to pray for him, so he told us what the thing was called, which I won't repeat on TV, which is what they referred to it, and we prayed for him and God healed him, which is fantastic. I won't say he was happy with his healing. He believed what we told him about it, but we've never seen any transformation. Never turned into. It never became. It was kind of nice for him, and that's often the case, if I can put it that way. It's only in the context of the relational, which is a very powerful thing in the way we're made. We love to have that sense of extended family, conversation, communication. You come into it, and often our understanding is, as actually was part of this group of young people that we worked with, was it's kind of God's good, he's really nice, thanks for that, but why should I change my lifestyle? He's grace, it's whatever. And those kind of things are challenged and shaped. Because we are not called to impose them and force them, they have to be offered and adopted, and that offering of an idea and the adoption of that idea is only happens in the place of real conversation, and conversation is between the two. It's real dialogue. It's not actually me just telling you the truth and you've got to accept it. So it's interesting to notice while they're healing the sick, raising the dead, cleansing the lepers, they are doing so from a group where there's a small community of someone that lives in the community, who is hosting them. There is a little familial context that you can bring people who are having their experiences into to talk about, and what does this mean? And it's the what does this mean that slowly embeds itself and produces real transformation. So I just think it's interesting that we find that sort of dynamic right at the heart. You see it again as we move into the period of Acts, where the next part of this sermon kind of relates to. um, as we get to that kind of period, we see it that Paul goes to the Jew first and then also to the Greek. So the Jew first, they already have synagogues, and within that they become a little subset within the and he finds a little group of folks who are interested in the dialogue, and that's already there. And then he's out on the street preaching, and there's Greeks coming in, but now they're coming into a context. It's just really the power of the way things like Alpha works, because it gives that conversational community. But it also, with Alpha, we often have the Holy Spirit days and we pray for the sick and so on. But it takes the experience and drops it into a place of conversation, because that's really where real long-term conversion transformation happens. You see the tension of the two. So you need often the supernatural gives you the possibility of being heard or listened to, gives an experience that then opens the person to joining in the conversation. But you need that broader context, because if just putting it bluntly, if I'm the evangelist on stage, my relationship with the person who responds is always kind of up here against down here. That's just the nature of the way that style happens. We put them in, and now it's kind of, okay, we're here as equals, but I've learned some things that I'm willing to share with you. What do you think about that? If that makes sense. So there's there's lessons that we can take and are really applicable today in the mission context, in evangelism context, in the Western world, which is now post-Christian. It's part of the way we have to understand what the way in which our commission works with Jesus. That it's no longer about putting on events that people will come to, and that has its place, but actually it's about us feeling confident in the meaning and the details of our faith enough to be able to share, this is how I see the world, this is what I've experienced of the world, this is how it's worked for me, and in that place to kind of offer things to people to understand their experience. So those are my thoughts on the opening of this sermon. Hopefully you can see the way it's developing. Does anyone want to ask anything or make any comments at this stage? If I look over here to where your faces are on my Zoom meeting.
I thought that was an interesting point about the because I'd wondered about that passage where Jesus says, "Don't go to this place, don't go to that place."
Yeah.
And your explanation is a very simple, and now that I've heard it, a very obvious explanation.
Yeah. So that we're starting with a real context, which is, actually you can't do everything, so you've got to know where you're starting. As I say, as you go on, suddenly Jesus is saying, when you're standing in front of kings and in front of governors, that's plural, that's suddenly all over the place, that's now moving on a stage. But this first call here to the kind of into Galilee, to give you the experience of how do you do this, just go where it's not too complex at the moment.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, thank you, Colin. Thank you. Any other thoughts or comments?
Yeah, I found that really helpful, what you said about freely you've received, freely give, and that context for seeing the supernatural, really. Because I think it does really take it back to grace, doesn't it? It's not, do I measure up enough? And it's interesting that if we do come with that, it would almost be dangerous for God to confirm that mindset, wouldn't it? Because we would think...
I agree. I think you're right, Barbara.
Yeah, so he can't.
No.
He couldn't endorse that because that would get us into all sorts of trouble. But coming from the place of grace, this is what God's done for me, he can do it for you. It puts the focus back on God, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I also, Kristen, just echo what Colin said there. It makes so much sense, your explanation of the way he dealt with that situation, and it can potentially be a bit confusing when even Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan, and yet here he's saying don't bother with them, and so it appears to almost be contradictory. But I remember when I first moved to London, this was in the mid-90s, and seeing two American evangelists at Hyde Park, and they were dressed as cowboys, and they had this whole almost like wrestling tag team kind of routine at Speaker's Corner. And I thought, they must be probably spending most of their preparation time just preparing for confrontation.
Yeah.
And they probably do get success. Don't want to mock what they do, but going into that context of deliberate confrontation is actually a distraction from getting on with something which could be very productive in the right environment.
Yeah, and there's an interesting phenomenon which I found is kind of more recent than historic, which is there's something about kind of we've turned fairness into a quality of God, which I don't think it is. Justice is a quality of the Lord. But what we think of as fairness is often a very human construct, which isn't always helpful. So for instance, we would tend to think, if somehow it's fairer if I kind of work harder on the less receptive people, because I'm going to push through for them, and that's really good. But actually, I think, the way that successful companies work is that they actually kind of go where it's relatively easy to sell, if I can put it that way. It's kind of like, I know it could be fair, we're going to be absolutely everywhere, but actually you can't be absolutely everywhere straight away. So on the whole, go where it's receptive and build up some strength in those places, because actually then you'll have a self-supporting, sustaining kind of community, and actually that's so fundamental anyway to the long term, that then folks can get added into that as and when. So there is a kind of a certain pragmatism, I think.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And there was something else I jotted down here. You just saying people perhaps not feeling worthy enough to pray for something which is really significant. My wife has her own charity, and they found out recently, one of the women who is part of the community that she helps had lost her son 29 years ago. He died about a month after being born.
Yeah.
And every year at this time, she goes into this season of mourning, basically from the date that her son was born until he died, it's almost 2 months. And she's suffered with this thing for 28 or 29 years. And so I'd said to my wife, because I'm involved with helping parents like that, I said, well, give me her details. I'll contact her and we'll see whether we can get her into meetings. When I did speak to her on the phone, she said that my wife and one of the volunteers had prayed for her.
Right.
And she said she felt like she'd actually been healed from this thing.
Fantastic. Yeah.
And so from all of the 29 years where you think that's going to need a lot of unwinding, and there probably will be some work to do.
Yeah.
But her being completely convinced now that this is the first time since it happened, that she actually feels it's lifted off her.
Yeah.
And that was from two people who aren't, they just decided out of kindness to pray for her.
Yeah. No, you tell that story, it reminds me very much, which when I was growing up was one of those kind of key testimonies, which is the story of Jennifer Rees Larkham, if you remember the name, who got healed from a wheelchair and so on, and she'd been prayed for by every big healing ministry you can imagine. I remember seeing her interviewed on television, because it's one of those stories that hit the national press and amongst other things. And the person who prayed for her was a kind of a newish Christian who didn't know any better, if I can put it that way. And she said, when she said, "Oh, can I pray for you?" she thought, "Yeah, I'll just be kind, let her pray." And that always struck me at that time. It was kind of like she was just responding in her simplicity as a Christian, as a new Christian, thinking, here's a lady in a wheelchair, I should pray for her. Without any knowledge of all of the history of all of the famous people who'd prayed in the past. And I suspect it's probably a reasonably common experience, put it that way.
Yeah, I like what you said about the shaking the dust off, because I've always interpreted that as on your own head, be it quite a negative. So having that positive attitude towards them, and then just moving on to fruitful things.
Yeah, and as we saw in the next verse, there is an element to which there is some truth to. It won't be tolerable for them, but it's not your mission. It's not our. You can't carry that. That's in many ways the Lord's responsibility, and that's always the tension, if I can put it that way. Is why if you look at the Pharisees of Jesus's day, there were two schools, one which was too progressive and one that was too strict. And Jesus actually kind of balances his way in between the two. He's not as permissive as Hillel, but neither is he as kind of uptight as Shammai. He balances his thing, which is, mission is serious, but it's not our mission, if that makes sense. And we don't actually aid it by kind of taking on board the kind of the ultimate elements of it, because we become unpleasant and judgmental at that point. We want to feel that the goodness of what we're doing, if I can put it that way, but at the same time, it's not irrelevant that we're doing this, but it's not our responsibility if it doesn't go the way we think it should.
I've thoroughly enjoyed this today. I think it's such an important teaching. And when you look at these verses, you could almost draw up a bingo card for poor evangelism based on these things, like the shaking off the dust. That's sort of, well, I've given you your last chance. So in love, now I'm shaking off the dust, and you can go to hell. And people do, unfortunately, approach evangelism like that.
Yeah, and because I would say that is then you taking on board, to go back a couple of verses. It's kind of like I got my blessing because I deserved it, and because I deserve it, I can give you a blessing. It's the total opposite of you received it freely, so give it freely. It's kind of pushing your experience and your position into play in the story, whereas the shaking of the dust off is not my responsibility. There may be consequences, but that's not my job.
There's a real humility in this, isn't there? Because there's a sense for me in which it's just, there's an ongoing situation that we're just a little part of, and that we give what we have to, and leave the rest with the Lord, in a sense.
Yeah. Good. Well, I'm glad it was helpful. Thank you, Mark. So that's good. That's good. So we've gone on more like 3/4 of an hour. I always try to say these are always supposed to try and keep them under half an hour, but there you go. I'm glad it's helpful. We'll be doing the second part of the sermon next week, and see if that's as helpful. Good. So I'll say a goodbye at this stage. I'm going off for my soup. In theory, because it's lunchtime, you guys are free to eat a sandwich while I'm talking. But I'm off for some lunch in a sec. So I will. I'll end the meeting and say goodbye to everyone.
Thank you very much, Kristen.
Thanks, Kristen.
Thank you.
Okay. See you next week, folks. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.